talk number 16. 14, 15, and 16 are all one piece in the notes, and they're more or less one piece. Let me remind you where we've come from. I'm trying to give you a big picture of the law. Starting with talk number 17, I will launch into the law itself, and basically we'll take it in three chunks. We'll do the Ten Commandments, the value statements, in apodictic form, thou shalt, and then we'll move on and selectively take some of the case study laws. If such and such happens, then you do that. And I will try to pick the more interesting ones. And then thirdly, and perhaps in a way new material for some of us, and I think perhaps for the sake of this argument most important, we will go back and expand what we've already introduced, and that is talk about how the law was a constitution for Israel and framed not only its religious activities, but clearly frames its political activities, its social activities, and its economic activities. So it really is a constitution that frames and guides the whole of Israel. All three of those, the Ten Commandments, the case study laws, and the framing of how Israel should work, the Constitution, all three of those have one goal, and that is to establish a just society which reflects the character of God. So now I've said that because it's very easy to get lost in the details. We've looked at the genre. I won't rehearse that for you. We've talked a bit about the fact that the law is embedded in the narrative line, which is important because it's the God acting in space-time in justice, primarily the Exodus event, that sets the pattern then for justice doing for Israel. We've talked a little bit about the different kinds, the apodictic and the case study laws. We'll come back and talk a bit more about that. Authorship. The authorship of the Code of Hammurabi is Hammurabi. The author of the Law of Moses is not Moses, but it is Yahweh God, isn't it? It's the Lord. We call it the Law of Moses, but it's not really the Law of Moses in the sense that he was the author. He was the scribe, as it were, but he was not the author. And then scope. We talked about the scope last week, and I tried to indicate that the law has a very, very broad scope, epitomized in the idea that it's a constitution. And so it's not just a narrow list of things that you do in order to be a good person. It's not a 10-rung stepladder by which you climb to heaven. That simply doesn't do anything at all to the law that's just in understanding it. It's a very broad thing. And Deuteronomy sees it as a good thing because it structures the society in a good way and becomes the Constitution. Now today we come to audience, and in the notes, if you have those, to page 6. I'm not sure audience is the best way to label this. Perhaps recipients would be a better way. Who received the law, and how did they receive the law, and what did they do with the law that they had received? To whom is the law accessible? So we're going to talk about audience and about application and about access. And in one sentence, I would simply say that the law was directed to all Israelites. They're the recipients. It's applied without distinction, in particular without class distinction. Israel is not a caste society. It is not a class society. And at least in principle, it was accessible to all. Now, I need to warn you, and I hope you had 2 cups of coffee before you came to this talk. This one's a bit boring, all right? And we've all done a lot of boring talks in our life, and this one's boring. It's because it's technical. And, I'll try to tell you a joke or two along the way to wake you up, and it will definitely ring a bell at the end of class to get you out of here and home for lunch. But this is a bit boring, but sometimes the boring bits are important. We probably, if we went to a doctor and she said, and I use she because my doctor's a she said, oh yes, chemistry, yes, quite important. I found it boring, so I didn't pay attention. We might want to change doctors, right? So although this is boring, it's sort of the chemistry of of what we're doing. And you've got to have a little bit of chemistry to be a good doctor. At least it used to be that way, didn't it? All right, now audience in the notes. Who is the audience? And we will read a few scriptures today, so turn with me in your Bibles to Deuteronomy. A great deal of what we're going to look at today comes from Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy says very clearly at the beginning, these are the words Moses spoke to all Israel. If you have an electronic concordance, you can look up the phrase all Israel very simply, and you would find that it occurs very often. It's worth chasing. If you turn over a page to chapter 5 and verse 1, just before the giving of the Ten Commandments, Moses summoned all Israel. And a little later on, that all Israel will be spelled out for us in chapter 31, and we'll come to that verse. It's the men, the women, the children, and the aliens. So it really is all-inclusive. It really is all Israel. The other passage that perhaps we should think about for a second is Deuteronomy chapter 4. And I'm going to discuss this passage with you in detail in a couple weeks. So I'm just going to read the last verse, 4:8, Deuteronomy 4:8. And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I am setting before you? Now, the you in Deuteronomy is not a throwaway word. It really is what makes Deuteronomy tick. It is the you who are to appoint judges in Deuteronomy 16. And this you, we're not quite sure who the you is, but surely it's all the elders, but in many cases it may be even broader. It may be the whole of Israel. So it's a very broad you. And even though it goes back and forth between the singular and the plural, that's not really a problem. Now, let me read you a bit from Berman. I've mentioned Joshua Berman before. He's a Jewish scholar who's written this book called Created Equal: How the Old Testament Broke with the Political Structure of the Ancient Near East. And I have been greatly influenced by Berman. I don't agree with him at every point, but he's very helpful. And I'm going to quote from him because he knows the ancient Near East in a way that I don't. And I should make my disclaimer again. I do not have a doctorate in the ancient Near East. And obviously by looking at me, I'm too old to go back and try it, aren't I? So I'm not going to do that. Oh, I have a pile of books, maybe 6 feet tall, all on the ancient Near East, that I'm trying to learn by osmotic breathing. You know, put my hand on, breathe deep, and see if I can't sort of get it that way. Berman asserts that by way of contrasts, texts which he calls long-duration texts, that is, texts that last and have an impact, not the little text that says, you know, come see me tomorrow, or I agree to buy this, or do that, and so on. You have a lot of those little broken texts in the ancient Near East left over that were quite momentary, but these are the long-duration texts, such as the Code of Hammurabi, which lasted, in terms of actually being around, about 1,000 years. Hammurabi is 200-300 years before Moses, and people copied and recopied and disseminated that list, that we call it a code, but list is probably better, of case study laws for over 1,000 years. It had a long duration. And Berman says that this long duration text, such as Codes of Hammurabi, was an affair for the scribal elite. Only in the rhetoric of the Bible is the message of the text addressed outward toward an entire people. Hear, O Israel, all Israel. The ancient Near Eastern texts were for the king and for the scribes and for the upper class elites. They were not intended for the wider class. That was not their intentionality. But in the Mosaic Code, it's very clear, and I just read you a few of them, I didn't read you very many, but in the Mosaic Code, it's very clear that the intentionality is not this way to the elite, but it's this way to all. So it's radically different in that sense. Now, the application of the law, and this one's a bit difficult. Let's turn to Exodus 12:48. I'd like for you to see it in your Bibles. I actually have written it into the notes, but it's nice to see it in the Bibles. Now let me remind you, while you're finding Exodus 12:48, that the Exodus itself hasn't happened yet, and we're at least 8 chapters before the Ten Commandments, and 4 or 5 months before the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments come in Exodus 20. But here in Exodus 12:48, we're already receiving instruction about how to behave as community. And 12:48 says, and if we read this as ancient Near Eastern people, we would find this absolutely stunning. Nothing like it in the ancient Near East. Absolutely stunning. And because we don't know the ancient Near East, we don't get the shock value, all right? So you'll have to trust me on that, or go read the ancient Near Eastern literature yourself. An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover. Now, an alien's different from a foreigner. A foreigner is someone who passes through, and he's probably selling you things and trading things, and he comes and he goes. He's maybe there a few days. An alien is someone who comes and lives with you and settles down, and probably, when they get into the land, is going to work the land with you. A resident alien. I have been a resident alien most of my life in the Philippines and in Kenya, and I still have my residence alien card with my photo and thumbprint, which I would show to a policeman when he stopped me, because I didn't really belong in Kenya, and they knew that, and they just wanted to keep that clear. All right? Resident aliens are nothing new, but resident aliens in Israel are treated rather differently. So 48, an alien who's come to reside among you, a resident alien, who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover. Now, how can he do that? How can an alien celebrate the Passover? Isn't that just for the people of God? Well, if you want them to do that, to celebrate the Lord's Passover, you must have all the males of that person's household circumcised. Then he, the alien, may take part like the one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat of it. Now look at verse 49. The same law applies to the native born and to the alien living among you. A people living under one law. And while none of us in this room are old enough to really go back in American history far enough to understand that there was clearly a time in our own country when we had 2 different sets of law, and it depended on your color which law you got, right? And Mesopotamia is going to know about that. Moses knows about that. So if you're in the notes now, turn to page 7, and let me just read quickly what I have to say about that. I've already read to you the text. The Code of Hammurabi, or in the Code of Hammurabi, there are 2 or 3 different penalties for crimes committed. The penalties are adjusted according to one's standing or valuation in society, with the upper class receiving deferential treatment because they are more highly valued. If one is in the middle valuation or ranking, a muskanim, a commoner, and offends against those ranked above him, a awilu, the penalty is greater. But if the muskanim offends against someone beneath his rank, a slave, warad is the name, I didn't write it in, the penalty is lesser. If an awilu offends against another awilu, the penalty is eye for eye. So let me just say, and then I'll read the text. The system works this way, that you had a 3-tiered system, and if the person in the first tier offended against the person who was in the first tier, then it was eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the so-called lex talionis, the idea of equal retribution. If this person offended against someone in the next set down, you had a different penalty applied. And if this person offended against someone in the third set down, you had a different penalty applied. and so on. If this person offended against someone of their own rank, you had the same penalty applied. If this person offended against someone above them, they were really in trouble, as you might imagine, right? And if this person offended against someone like this, then you had and these penalties are spelled out in great detail. It's a little complicated. Now I'm going to read a passage to you, law number 196 and following, and just see if you can get the flavor of it, and we'll try to, draw a conclusion at the end. If a man, and man here is awilu, he belongs to the top, put out the eye of another awilu, his eye shall be put out. Huh? Fairness, equal, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And of course, within its context, this was so that if I knocked out your eye, you didn't knock off my head. All right? I mean, we need to understand that it's really constrictive, not expansive. All right? And in the Old Testament, has the same function. You knock out my eye, I don't knock off your head. I mean, it's to make it equal. 198, if he, the awilu, put out the eye of a freedman, a muskenim, or break the bone of a freeman, a muskenim, he shall pay 1 gold mina. If he put out the eye of a man, of a man's slave, now this is the third tier down, warad, or break the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 of its value. Now that one is not too clear, you just got to keep reading a bit. All right, so that's the eye business. Now we're going to take up teeth. If a man, a wilu, knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. So there we got that idea again. 201, if he knock out the teeth of a freedman, the guy below him, he shall pay 1/3 of a gold mina. All right? Then we get to the ones about the body. If anyone, awilu, strike the body of another awilu. Now, within the awilu, there seems to be gradations. So you've got some refinement here in the code. Higher in rank than he shall receive 60 blows with an ox whip in public. All right? So that makes it a little bit more complicated. 203, if a freedman, an awilu, strike the body of another free-born man, another awilu, or equal rank, he shall pay 1 gold mina, which is 60 shekels. Now, watch the shekels. This one's very clear. If a freedman, a muskenim, strike the body of another freedman, another muskenim, he shall pay 10 shekels. And if a slave, a warad, of a freeman strike the body of a freeman, so he's going up, all right, the slave is striking up, his ear will be cut off. Now, may I just read you my note? On first reading, these laws are a bit confusing. I'd say they're actually very confusing, wouldn't you? Yeah, you probably need a lawyer to do this. On first reading, these laws are a bit confusing, but the tenor of the section is clear. 2 factors are at work, and trying to tease them out is the hard part here. First, penalties in the Code of Hammurabi are suited to the crime, eye for eye. It's the lex talionis. The second one, and this is the tricky one, the application of the penalties, or the application of the penalties is adjusted according to the status or value of the one who commits the crime and the status and the value of the victim of the crime. The first provision, eye for eye, is a basic principle of justice. Punishment must be fair. But the second principle at work, justice according to class, or one might call it justice according to caste, is from the modern, at least American point of view, and the biblical point of view, unjust. So, in my star of justice, do you remember the star of justice? Forensic, retributive, distributive on this side, that is the negative and the positive, and standard and conduct on this side, and fair in the middle. The judge, the forensic person, has to do it without a bribe. Now, in terms of standard, there has to be just one standard, and it has to be applied fairly. The lex talionis, eye for eye, is clearly a matter of fairness. But what happens in the Code of Hammurabi that you don't find in the law, when you move out here to the Code of Hammurabi, that the standard is adjusted according to who's been offended. So the alien and the homeborn would be on different levels. Do you follow that? But the law of Israel says there's one law, which in effect is saying there's one class, one caste, one value. All people, to put it in modern jargon, are of equal value before the law. In the Code of Hammurabi, all people were not of equal value before the law. Now that really does make the law of Moses different at that point. Now let me remind you how we're doing this. We're comparing the larger picture of the ancient Near East idea of law with the idea of law in Israel. And the case study laws, where you do find the similarities, are actually within Israel a very small part of the law. They're not really the bulk of the law or the driving force of the law. Whereas in the Code of Hammurabi, they are the law. That's all there is to it. Is I think 206 case studies, something like that. And there isn't anything else. There's no Ten Commandments. There's no constitution. There's no structuring of these things. So the law of Israel is much broader in its scope. But even at this sort of micro point of view, where there is a lot of similarity, even at the micro point of view, there is radical dissimilarity in the sense that the way the law is applied in terms of fairness depends on where you stand in society. Now, we're all Americans in this room, and we sort of take that as a given, don't we? But you know, even in our very modern world, you and I could get on an airplane and tomorrow morning arrive in places where that's not a given. That is not a given. And how you're treated in the face of the law depends on what group you were born into, or what color you are, or what faith you have. That the mechanisms of legality are dependent on the value assigned to you. And so there's a great deal to think about here missiologically, all right? Are you interested in missions? I know you are. We are a faith missionary church, aren't we? And I think one of the keys to making the gospel, and I use that very broadly, effectively, is understanding the driving social view of the Scriptures. What is God's vision for His people? And part of it is a system that really is radically fair, and not just approximately fair. So I'm going to leave that with you and move on then to the next question at hand, and that is accessibility. If we talked about the audience here, who is the audience, then I want to move on from audience, and I want to ask about accessibility. Who can get to this law? Now I'm skating out on thin ice, and I can already hear it breaking. And so you want to take this with a kilo of salt and just go and read the books and see what you can do. Accessibility. Who can get to this law? If you had the world's most perfect law, and if you had just an absolutely marvelous law, but you couldn't get to it, it wouldn't do you much good, would it? So the question here is accessibility. And again, I'm going to suggest that there's a very sharp difference between accessibility in Israel and accessibility in the ancient Near East. Now, we're talking at the hypothetical level. We're not actually talking about what happened. It's very hard to reconstruct what happened in that ancient period of history. There's just not enough evidence. But at least at the idea of the intention of the law, we can at least talk about that. So availability. Although there were many law collections in the ancient Near East, of which the Code of Hammurabi is the most famous. Most of the law collections were inaccessible to the common person because they were not available in public. You couldn't actually go and see one of these things. Now, the Code of Hammurabi seems to be an exception. There was a stele with it on there, and it did get moved around a bit, but apparently it was out in the public for a while, and it seems to be something, and I do say that carefully, of an exception. Now, I go back to Berman again. I'm following him here. In his 4th chapter, entitled Egalitarian Technology, Alphabet, Text, and Class, he argues that there is a marked distinction between access to texts in Israel and its neighbors, namely Mesopotamia and Egypt. All Israelites had access to the long-duration text. But, and I'm simply summarizing his evidence, you have to go and read it, but in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, these are the two great neighbors, availability to long-duration texts was limited, says Berman, to the elite, that is, the scribes, the officials, and of course the king. And Sasson, who's really perhaps the world expert on the ancient Near East, has this to say. He says, who's an authority in matters and editor of the Massive Civilization of Ancient Near Eastern Studies, writes in his article on King Hammurabi that although he styles himself King of Justice, a title which seems to be justified by his action, and although he speaks of having his law read out to the person who needs justice so that he may be comforted, Sasson goes on to say, nevertheless, in spite of all these sort of, this law is going to work for everybody, he says this about the Code of Hammurabi. In terms of its form, it was on an 8-foot-tall black basalt stone. I myself don't see that as a terrible problem, but Sasson seems to think that's a bit formidable. Then he goes on to say its location, and here we're guessing, probably in a temple next to a statue of Hammurabi as King of Justice. And its script, now here we're not guessing, highly archaic. So it's like reading Chaucer, right? Yeah, no, that's the idea. It's like reading Chaucer. Must have made it, says Sasson, accessible only to the very learned, not at all to the person who normally sat in judgment at the city or the temple gate. So his assessment is that even though it's supposed to be out there and Hammurabi proclaims himself as King of Justice, that in reality the thing is very difficult to get to. It's very difficult to get to. Now, I don't want to leave off the ancient Near East and go to meddling, and I'm not reading American hardly. I've been gone too long. But as one coming back into the culture and just listening on the edges, it strikes me as interesting that getting access to justice in our dear country is becoming more and more difficult, isn't it? Years ago, my wife and I got our feet tangled up when our realtor sold our house to two people. Not recommended. They were angry, the realtor was angry, and we got sucked in. All four of us had lawyers. The lawyers made a lot of money on my house. I lost a lot of money on my house. And it was very hard to figure out exactly what was going on, right? This is a very minor case, But I quickly realized that every time I talked to my lawyer, I could hear a click. That was the meter going on, And I don't speak against lawyers. My father's a lawyer, and I'd like for my daughters to be lawyers. I think it's a great profession. But you can hear the click going on. I see you lawyers smiling, and I hope you are smiling. The click goes on, and I think it was $120 an hour, and this is 20 years ago. And so I tried to talk fast. But I realized that for some people, accessibility to justice, I don't need to fill in the blanks, do I? I don't need to fill in the blanks. And here you have it here. Berman's thesis is that the Pentateuch displays an attitude toward the dissemination of text among the populace that is in sharp contrast to the relationship between texts and society we find elsewhere in the ancient Near East. The tablets of the Ten Commandments were to be stored in the Ark of the Testimony, or Ark of Covenant. We shall come to that shortly in our discussion of the tabernacle, along with other written portions of the law and the written song and the written narrative. They were stored there for safekeeping, but they were to be available via public reading, which we'll come to in a minute, memorization, and writing on public stones, and on private door frames, and perhaps even on one's hands and forehead. To put it very succinctly, in terms of the Israelite law, its intention was to be widely available. Whereas the codes of the ancient Near East did not have that intention. So it's a very different sort of world. Now, I'd like for us to read two texts. Turn with me to Deuteronomy 31, and we'll read two texts that talk about accessibility. One of them, I hope you'll find both of them very interesting, but one of them I think you will find very interesting because Paul quotes it in a rather different context. But let's start with Deuteronomy 31 and verse 9. 31:9. Now, I'm going to ask you to imagine today. We've grown up with books. And if we want to learn something, we look at a book. Although I realize by looking at some of you, you now look at a Nook, not a book, right? Or a Kindle, or an iPod, or an iPad, or all these other things that I don't have. But I do have a computer. And I do read off the computer as you do too, don't I? And we're a book society. And we communicate by written means. That's not the way the world worked up until very recently. Thanks only to Gutenberg do we do things that way, right? But most of the world history did things very, very differently. And here's a text that comes from that very different world. Listen carefully. So Moses wrote down this law. It was written. It was written. And we as evangelicals would hold that Moses wrote it. Now it may have been edited by later editors, fine. And someone obviously had to write up Moses' own death. But Moses actually wrote this thing, or he dictated it to Joshua or somebody. So Moses wrote down this law, it's always in a written form, and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. That's where it was stored. And he also gave it to all the elders. So it's in the hands of the priests, who are the teachers, and in the hands of the elders. Now, I think the presumption here is that the elders and the priests were literate. I'm going to talk about literacy today. The presumption here is that they could read. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to alphabet. But the presumption is that they could read. In the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, only 1% of the population could read. 3% at the very most. But generally speaking, 1%. All right? Now, we'll come back to that. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, which is described in Deuteronomy 15, during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a grand party. We're going to come to the tabernacle next time around. And the tabernacle is a grand party where you go to meet all your cousins, and there's a lot of meat to eat, and there's a lot of singing, and a lot of dancing, and I dare not say it too loudly, a lot of drinking, although I suppose under 18 you aren't allowed to. But, it was just a wonderful time. And what did you do during the day? You went somewhere, and either the priest or the elders, they probably took turns, stood up, and they read to you. All right? You might not be able to read, but they read to you. When all Israel, and there's another all Israel phrase, all right, and it'll be defined in a second, comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you, now exactly who the you is a bit difficult, you shall read this law. I presume it's the priest and the elders in this case. You shall read this law, and how much of the law? whenever it says law, it's a little difficult. It's probably more than 10 Commandments. It may include the case study laws. It may include the whole Pentateuch, because the whole Pentateuch is called Torah, is called law in that sense. So maybe it was the whole thing. I'm inclined to think it's the broad thing. You shall read this law before them in their hearing. Do you see that? This is an oral society. You and I are not really members of oral societies. Not really. And this is an oral society, and it's all about hearing. Verse 12, assemble the people. Now, who's going to hear? Men, women, children, and aliens living in your towns. So this is very inclusive. There, the intentionality of the audience is very clear again. So they can do what? So they can read it? No, so they can listen. They're listeners. And when they listen, what do? Unlike us, maybe. They learn. Right? They learn. They learn by listening. When I went to Asia, I was told very early on that Chinese education was by rote. That is, you learn by memorization. And of course, we sort of looked down on that because we thought our educational system was superior. I'm not quite so sure about that, especially since the Chinese are about to take over, as you well know. We'd all better start studying Mandarin. But my Chinese students could learn by rote. I had the unfortunate experience of sitting next to a Chinese all the way through 4 years of Greek in college. Her name was Wong, my name was Wood. We sat together. Wood was often wrong, but Wong was never wrong. And Wong made no wrongs. In 4 years of Greek, she never got anything less than a 100. I couldn't believe it. I said, how did she do that? She was from an oral society. Everything she heard stuck. Everything she heard stuck. Is that the way it works for you? No, some of you need a new upgrade of your memory chip. It's not large enough or shiny enough or something. But oral society, we need to remember oral society, things stick. You carry things in your head. I have had students sit in my class at NEGST who could recite without error their genealogy going up for 10 generations. I bet there's not a person in this room that can get beyond great-great-grandfather from memory. All right? You go home, get the chart, and pull it out. But they could do it from memory going up. And it's really quite remarkable. So they were to listen and to learn to fear the Lord your God and to follow carefully all the words of this law. Now, someone asked a very perceptive question 2 weeks ago. They said, isn't the law too complicated to learn? Well, yes and no. But I think part of the problem is that we don't really appreciate the capacity of people in an oral society to learn large sections of material. All right? I mean, it can be done. I have a 97-year-old father. Now, he's not quite traditional, but he goes back pretty far. And he's a little unusual, and some of you who know him know he's quite unusual. My father still can recite from memory long Latin poems that he memorized 80 years ago. And when I take my father to places, he knows everybody by name. And if he doesn't, as he goes in, he asks people's names. And 2 hours later, when he comes out, he greets them by name when he goes out. And 2 months later, when I bring him back for his follow-up appointment, he greets everybody by name. I say, how do you do that? He's not writing them down, you know. Well, there's something of that oral society in my father who lived through the Depression. He learned to memorize things. I came too late into the educational system to really appreciate that. But he's sort of on the edges of this. Verse 13, their children who do not know this law must, what? Hear it. Do you hear that? They must hear it, not read it. They must hear it. And that gives us an enormous clue as to how this thing worked. Because someone's going to say pretty quickly, did they all have Bibles? Well, no, they didn't, did they? Were there Bibles? Well, no, there wasn't. Moses was writing the Bible, wasn't he? I mean, the ink wasn't even dry. And where was it? Well, it was off in the tabernacle inside the Ark of the Covenant. And at least at start, there was only one of them, although we presume that they copied them. There weren't very many, were they? So how could all Israel hear the word? Well, you read it, but how are you going to learn it? People sitting there hearing the law read retained it. Now, I know to you and me that just seems unbelievable, doesn't it? But it could be done. It is done. They retained it and they went back to their village. There was no TV. There was no radio. There was certainly no iPod or any other pod. And so what did you do at night? There's no electricity. What did you do at night as you sat by the campfire? And I've seen this done in Africa. The older people, the repositories of wisdom, would start reciting the stories, right? And this could go on for hours and hours. And so you'd start and you'd say, let's recite Deuteronomy tonight, although it wasn't called Deuteronomy at that time. And so someone would stand up and would recite Deuteronomy. You say it can't be done. Well, as a matter of fact, actually, even by us, it can be done if we put our minds to it. I've heard people recite large skeins of the Bible. It actually can be done. And so it was passed along that way. Now, I've labored that because if you had to go and read it, it wouldn't work, right? But if you heard it over a 7-day period, every 7th year, and then you went home to the village, and the village Levi and the village elder took turns reciting the Torah and the stories in the Torah, eventually you would get it. Now let me read you another one that is even more interesting in a way. And it's in chapter 30, verse 11. And we know this one from Paul. And now we're going to know it from Moses. Now what I am commanding you, says Moses today, is not too difficult. And we'll come back later and talk about whether or not the law was doable, okay? Is the law doable? But that's not really what this text is talking about. It's not too difficult or for you or beyond your reach. And I take beyond your reach to have to do with availability. Can you access it? Can you reach it? And I think that's very clear in the text. Here he talks about it. Can you get to the law? It is not up in heaven, so that you have to ask, who will ascend to heaven to get it and to proclaim it to us that we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. Where is it? It's in your head. It's in your memory. It's in the memory of the village elders. It's in the memory of the Levites and priests. And as you grow up, it should be in your memory too. It's very near you. It is indeed in your mouth. And it's in your mouth because it's oral. You talk it. It's in your mouth and in your heart so that you may obey it. So this text, which is often read to be more about keeping the law, is also really about the predicate, and that is you have to know the law before you can keep it, and it's knowable, it's accessible, it's available. You can get to this sort of thing. Now, quickly, and partly because we're getting out on the thin ice here, and you see the notes are quite thin, like to talk about literacy for a minute. Literacy and alphabet are complex and fairly technical issue. The truth is that we know very little about either in any great detail. But I want to talk a little bit about literacy and talk about the level of literacy in the ancient Near East and Israel. Just to simply say it's disputed. Ancient Near East, general agreement, 1%. Israel, depends who you read. If you read Ralston, he'll say not very many. If you read Hess and Millard, they'll say it's more than you would think. And it's not just at the top level, You have evidence of people lower down level, and it's not just the city. You've got some archaeological evidence of it being out in the villages. And I think the discussion is going to go on that one. It's not absolutely crucial to what we're saying here. I'm a bit more inclined to follow Millard and Hess, although there are very respectable scholars on the other side of the question. And it has to do more with how you interpret the archaeological evidence and actually having it, obviously. And there's just not enough evidence to be absolutely clear on this one. But I am inclined to think that reading was fairly broad in Israel, maybe 5%, maybe 10%. We're talking about the upper, older people. But if you've got a small number of people who can read, then the whole village gets this sort of thing, all right? So, literacy in Israel probably was different from the ancient Near East, although I wouldn't want to stake my life on that one. The interplay of oral recitation from memory and written materials, I think I've talked enough about that. You get the idea. That we have to imagine our way into a different world where you can have a written text, but a written text doesn't replace orality and memorization and the reciting of the text from memory. Why would you recite a text from memory if it's written down? Well, the answer in Israel is because you don't have one, right? Now, we've got one, so we tend not to do that. But we need to understand it's in a world where there is a written text, there is a base. But for most people, the access to that is through listening and through repetition. It's in their mouths, not in their eyes. That's how it happens. Now, the Ten Commandments, as an example of this, were written on the 2 tablets, but then Moses turns right around and he says to Israel, "Hear, O Israel," right? He doesn't say, "Read, O Israel." He says, "Hear, O Israel." It's an oral society. The Song of Moses, the Song of Justice, is written down, it's for teaching, and in this case, it's for singing. And Deuteronomy 32 is a pretty long piece of text, but apparently they memorized it and they sang it. So we mustn't think that this oral recitation is necessarily just reciting it from memory on a stand-up basis. There would clearly be recitation that was hymnic, that was melodic in some sense, and that certainly aids to it. There are probably people in this room who could sing the whole of the Messiah without looking at the text. Right? I mean, I know there are. I'm married to one. All right? And I'm sure that there's others in this room who can do that. You could sing the whole of the Messiah without having to have the written text in front of you and get it about 95% right. Yeah, it works, doesn't it? And Israel sang things. I mean, we're going to come to a whole block of material called the Psalter, the hymn book, the Psalms, and they sang these things. Now, just a couple personal reflections. I'll do this quickly, and then we'll have time for discussion. I'd like to think about my own experience with this in Asia and Africa, and I can never be anything less than a missionary, and I'm always thinking about these things as a missionary. Reading in Africa is an oral, that is an allowed social event, and not a silent one. If I say to you, "Have you read something recently?" you'll say, "Oh yes, I'm reading a book." "Where?" "Oh, in my room with the door shut and the curtain pulled down and one light, and I'm reading the text." No. If you're in Africa or if you're in Asia and you're reading, the whole neighborhood is reading with you. Because, first of all, you read aloud. I mean, did not the Ethiopian eunuch in the chariot read aloud? Huh? And he's reading. Why is he reading aloud? Because that's the way you did things. You read them aloud, even if there was no one in the room. But if you live in Africa and Asia, there's always someone in the room, right? And so you read aloud, and the whole village gets it, right? One television in an African village means that everybody has television. Do you understand? Doesn't work that way where you live, does it? One television, I've seen this, in an African village means that everybody has one radio, everybody has radio. They come and they hang in the windows and they look in the, you know. And so we need to remember that when they read the text or when they recited the text, in this case, that the whole village would get in on this. Oral societies repeat stories, and you can see this in the Hebrew text itself. When I was in language school, my teacher said to me, Chester, when you get into the taxi cab and you want to go to Quiapo, you say, gusto kong pupunta sa Quiapo. And the taxi cab driver will say to you, yung gusto pupunta sa Quiapo. And then you say, ay, gusto kong pupunta sa Quiapo. Now, if you're an American, you simply get in a cab and you say, Quiapo. Right? That's the end of the discussion. The cab goes. If you get into a cab in Manila and you see Quiapo, the cab won't go anywhere. No. Does the driver know where Quiapo is? It's the center of Manila. I'll bet he does. Why doesn't he go? Because you haven't communicated. You haven't communicated. If I invite you for lunch, you're not invited until I invite you the third time. So be careful. When you're invited, it has to happen 3 times. Repetition is essential to communication. I read a fascinating study years ago in an anthropological magazine that says if American students discuss a topic in a unit of 1, Filipinos do it in a unit of 3, measuring the time, Africans do it in a unit of 5. Bring your lunch. Maybe 2 lunches. And so you have oral repetition. When you read Genesis 24, which is longer than the whole creation story, it's about Isaac getting a wife, isn't it? It's Abraham getting a wife for Isaac. The story is repeated 3 times. You say, hey, let's edit this thing. Oh, no, if you edit it, it won't make sense. It's a communication. It still reflects the orality of the original communication. And you can see that if you look for it in the Bible. That probably helps explain a lot of the things that are going on in the text that completely mystify us modern people who think it should be said once and said right the first time, and that's it. But a lot of things in the Bible are said many times and said a little differently, and then we say, how can we straighten out these errors? No, maybe it's us that need to be straightened out. If we were oral, maybe we'd have a very different idea about what's going on, all right? All right, now one last very quick word, alphabet. And I'm following here Berman, who follows Seth Sanders, who's a brilliant young ancient Near Eastern scholar who published his doctoral dissertation called Inventing Hebrew, by which he means the language. And if we think about the alphabet, in Mesopotamia, the alphabet came in, or not the alphabet, but writing came into being in cuneiform script, which has 300 signs, in about 3000 BC. About the same time in Egypt, hieroglyphics came onto the scene with about 700 signs, all right? 1,500 years later, in Ugarit, which is fairly near where Israel is, the people at Ugarit developed a sign system that had not 300 or 700, but had 30. And each symbol represented a sound. It was the beginning of alphabet. The Israelites adopted that and adapted it. Later the Greeks, and later still the Romans modifying it. But it was a breakthrough comparable only to Gutenberg. Absolutely incredible breakthrough, because what it meant was an average person could learn to read. To be a scribe in Mesopotamia or a scribe in Egypt took years and years and years and years of disciplined hard work to learn all those things. Learning Chinese would be like that today. I mean, you can learn to speak Chinese, but to learn to read and write Chinese is an entirely different game. And so the alphabet simply simplified the whole thing. And Berman and Sanders argue that what happened is that these people who had the alphabet, it got merged with a political movement, and they used the alphabet then to write a story because they were lower rung people. to write a story about themselves, about us, about people. And this was an incredible break with all the other literature, because the other literature is about me, and I happen to be Hammurabi. All right? It's not about you, and it's not about us. It's about me. It's about Hammurabi. It's about the Pharaoh. And now you have a literature that's about us. It's about a people. And slowly then you have emerging a literature in story form and with law mixed into it that is about the formation of a people. And the Pentateuch is absolutely unique in ancient Near Eastern literature. There is nothing like the Pentateuch in the other literature. No long story explaining how a people, it's about a people, right? Not about a king, because there wasn't any king, was there? There was no king. It's about the emergence of a people. And so the Pentateuch is the first known story about the emergence of a people. And Berman and Sanders argue that this was greatly facilitated by the alphabet. Now, not everybody agrees with the idea of the facilitation of the alphabet, and I understand that. And it may be that it really wasn't quite so lockstep as you got an alphabet and then you wrote about yourself, because people at the lower levels could do that. But it is very clear, however we get to it, that the Pentateuch is a story about us as a people and not about the king. And in that sense, it's a radical break with everybody else in the neighborhood.